He had plans for the future, including applying to college to study art. He had no history of depression or suicidal tendencies. But even if we assume a sudden mental breakdown, this does not explain the physical impossibility of moving those rocks alone. Ranger David Rusk, who led the search, said in an unofficial interview 10 years later, "In 30 years of working for the Park Service, I've seen dozens of tragedies. People fall off cliffs, drown in rivers, freeze to death in blizzards, or are killed by bears. Each of these deaths leaves a mark, subject to the laws of physics. There is always logic, albeit cruel. In Kane's case, there was no logic. It felt like we were dealing with something that operated according to completely different rules, rules that were alien to us. This wasn't just a murder. It was like some statement, but we couldn't read it." The search continued for another 2 weeks, but to no avail. Neither Andrew's backpack nor the Canon camera he used to take his last photo was ever found. This is particularly tragic. The only thing that could have shed light on the last moments of his life, the image on the film, disappeared with him. What happened? We will never know. Perhaps Andrew did encounter people, and what they did with his belongings was the result of drugs or a cruel, twisted mind. Maybe something even stranger happened beyond our comprehension. But the facts remain: a shirt buried under heavy rocks, boots standing alone half a mile, and no trace of the man who strayed from the group for just a moment to capture the beauty of the glacier. That beauty was the last thing he ever saw. And his story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries have no answers, leaving behind only emptiness and unanswered questions. That's all, folks. The mysterious disappearances in Alaska remain unsolved, and each new story only reinforces the feeling that these lands hold secrets that are best left untold. If you found this interesting, like, subscribe, and write in the comments which of these stories you find the most mysterious. There are even more creepy and inexplicable cases ahead. Don't miss them. Alaska is not just a land of glaciers and endless forests. It is a place where people disappear as if the earth itself swallows them up.
Good morning. Is it on? Can you hear me? Good. Good morning, everybody.
Swallows them up. Tourists, scientists, entire families, they venture into the wild and never return. There, torn tents are found with no signs of the struggle, backpacks hanging from treetops, shoes with the laces removed, and belongings neatly arranged in places where no human could have reached them. And every time, there are no clues or answers. What are these lands hiding? Why do experienced tourists and explorers who know all the rules of survival disappear without a trace in the mountains and tundra? Today, we will tell you about 3 disappearances, each of which became not just a tragedy, but a mystery that frightens even the most seasoned rescuers. Let's start with the story of Fred Larson, an engineer and experienced traveler, who in the summer of 1987 set out on a solo hike at the foot of Mount Ilia and was never seen again. Fred Larson was 36 years old. He was no stranger to the wilderness. A civil engineer from Oregon, he spent every vacation in the mountains. He was an experienced solo hiker, methodical and cautious. He knew how to read a map, how to handle a weapon, and most importantly, how to respect the wilderness. Alaska was his lifelong dream. In June 1987, he finally realized it when he flew into Fort Ellsworth. This tiny village serves as the gateway to Lake Clark National Park. His plan was ambitious but feasible for someone with his skill level. A 3-day solo hike along the Little foot of Mount Ilia. On the morning of June 14th, he checked in at the ranger station as required. He left a copy of his itinerary, indicated his expected return date, June 17th, and slinging his well-worn backpack over his shoulder, set off. When Fred didn't return on the 17th, no one panicked. In places like this, a day or two delay is typical. A small river can swell after rain and cut off the way back. A slight illness can force a tourist to wait out the day in a tent. But when he didn't show up on the 19th and his name didn't appear on the list of passengers departing from Port Ellsworth, the Rangers sounded the alarm. The search operation began from the air. Pilots of small planes circled for hours over Fred's presumed route, scanning the endless green carpet of the Tiger. It was an almost hopeless task. Finding one person in this ocean of trees was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Days passed with no results. Hope faded with each sunrise. Then, on the 10th day after his disappearance on June 24th, the pilot of one of the search planes spotted something. It was a small, barely discernible patch of unnatural color in the forest clearing. When the helicopter with the rescuers landed nearby, they realized they had found Fred's camp, and what they saw immediately alarmed them. The small single-person tent stood on level ground, but one of its walls had been torn open. It was not a neat cut made with a knife. The fabric was torn and stretched as if something large and powerful had broken through it. Inside the tent was a mess. An empty sleeping bag lay crumpled in shambles.
Now in the circle, come on, man.
In an instant. A flashlight lay nearby, still on. The batteries were dead, but the switch was in the on position. This suggested that something had happened during the night. But the strangest thing was what wasn't in the tent. There were no traces of blood, no scraps of clothing. There were no signs of a struggle inside. And more importantly, there were no traces around the tent. The ground was covered with soft moss that would have preserved any footprints, from a heavy human boot or a bear's paw. But the moss was untouched. It seemed that whatever had torn the tent apart had not walked on the ground. Experienced rangers immediately thought of a grizzly. The tear in the tent was like a claw mark. A sudden awakening in the night panic. It all fell. They began combing the area for signs of a predator. They found nothing. Not a single paw print. Not a single scratch on the trees. No droppings. Nothing to indicate the presence of a large animal in the area. Then one of the rescuers, scanning the edge of the forest, looked up and froze. "Guys, you should take a look at this," he said over the radio, his voice filled with bewilderment. About 50 feet from the camp, at the very top of a tall old spruce tree, hung Fred's backpack. It was hanging at least 30 feet high. One of its straps was neatly hooked onto a sharp piece of broken branch near the trunk. The backpack hadn't been thrown up there. It would have gotten tangled in the lower branches. It had been placed there deliberately. The backpack at the top of the tree became the central element of this mystery. It wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a symbol of the absolute irrationality of what had happened. To reach it, one of the most experienced rangers, a professional tree climber, had to use special equipment. When he lowered the backpack to the ground, the mysteries deepened. First, the tree trunk was smooth without any hooks or scratches. There were no traces of bear claws that could have climbed up there. There were also no traces of climbing equipment or human boots. No one and nothing had climbed this tree from the ground. Second, the contents of the backpack. It was almost complete. Inside were Fred's documents, his wallet with money, a route map, a compass, a lighter, and a small supply of food. Everything was there. This ruled out robbery, but most importantly, his Ruger Super Blackhawk .44 caliber revolver was in its holster, in the side pocket. It was a powerful weapon, capable of stopping a bear. It had not been used. All 6 bullets were still there. The man who had panicked and rushed out of the tent at night did not take the weapon with him, which was in his backpack. Instead, the backpack somehow ended up on top of a tree. The official version of the bear attack began to fall apart. Yes, a bear could have torn the tent apart, but it wouldn't have hung the backpack neatly on a tree. It would have torn it to shreds in search of food. It would have left traces. And surely, if a bear had dragged Fred away, there would have been drag marks and blood on the ground. But there was none of that. The search continued with renewed vigor, now with a focus on the criminal angle. Perhaps Fred had encountered poachers or illegal miners, but this version did not explain the key details. Why would criminals kill a tourist? Criminals kill a tourist and then spend time and effort hanging his backpack on a tree. It was a senseless and risky move. Days turned into weeks. Search parties combed the area square by square. Then, 3 weeks after the camp was discovered, a group of volunteers made their final discovery. About a mile from the camp, in a marshy hollow, they found Fred's hiking boot. It was half submerged in the mud. It was laced up. The foot inside was missing. Forensic experts examined the boot and found no teeth or claw marks. The leather was intact. The foot had simply been removed without damaging the boot. That was the last thing ever found belonging to Fred Larson. His body was never found. The case was at a dead end. Despite all the inconsistencies, the official conclusion was missing, presumed dead, as a result of a bear attack. It was a convenient and straightforward explanation that allowed the case to be closed. But none of those who worked on the case believed it. In private conversations, the Rangers discussed another, far more disturbing possibility. They talked about something else living in those woods, not a bear and not a man. The local Danina Indians tell legends of hairy people, or Nantunik, creatures that look like humans but are covered in fur, possess enormous strength and can move through the forest without leaving a trace. They are known for occasionally stealing from people or spying on them from a distance. They are usually not aggressive, but sometimes. Could something like this have taken an interest in Fred's camp? Could it have used its strength to tear down the tent and then, out of curiosity or some kind of incomprehensible logic, throw the backpack up into a tree? This version explains the lack of footprints, if the creature moved through the trees, the incredible height at which the backpack was found, and why no weapons were used. Perhaps it all happened so quickly that Fred simply didn't have time to react. We will never know the truth. The story of Fred Larson is not just a report about a missing tourist. It is a story about an encounter with something that does not fit into our picture of the world. Something powerful, intelligent, but operating according to a logic entirely alien to us. Something that can tear your refuge apart, and then, as if to mock you, hang your backpack on top of a tree, leaving rescuers and investigators completely baffled. But these are just guesses from a myth, with no objective evidence to back them up. Dr. Samuel Holloway was a man of science. As a field biologist specializing in Arctic ecosystems, he was accustomed to order, data, and logical conclusions. Nature was a complex but knowable system to him. In September 1995, he and his 17-year-old son Elias set up a small research camp in the upper reaches of the Noatak River. Their task was to collect samples of mosses and lichens to study the effects of climate change. For Samuel, it was work. For Elias, it was an adventure. He had grown up on such trips, was experienced and responsible beyond his years, had an excellent sense of direction in the wilderness, and was an indispensable assistant to his father. October 3rd was unusually calm for that time of year. A light snow fell during the day, covering the tundra with a thin, pristine layer several inches thick. By evening, the sky had cleared, and there was no wind. The temperature dropped to 24.8 Degger, cool, but quite comfortable for Alaska. Father and son finished their work, had dinner in their heated tent, and prepared to process the day's samples. Around 7 in the evening, Elias got up and said he wanted to take a short walk. "I'll walk over to the weather station and check the gauges. I'll be back in 20 minutes, he said. The weather station was only a couple of hundred yards from the camp, a simple structure consisting of a tripod and a few instruments. It was a routine, daily task. Elias put on his boots and a warm jacket and left the tent. Samuel, absorbed in his work, didn't notice how time had passed. When he looked up from the microscope and glanced at his watch, it was almost 8. Elias was still not back. Samuel stepped outside the tent. The silence was absolute. Not just silence, but a vacuum. There was no sound of wind, no cry of a night bird, no rustling of grass. This ringing, unnatural silence made him feel uneasy for the first time. He called out his son's name. There was no answer. He grabbed a powerful flashlight and followed the tracks. They were clearly visible in the fresh snow, clear prints of his son's boots. The first thing Samuel noticed as a scientist was the nature of the tracks. They were perfectly straight. The steps were even, confident, with no signs of haste or panic. Elias didn't zigzag or look around. He walked in a straight line as if following a ruler toward a small stream flowing nearby. And here, at the very edge of this stream, Samuel Holloway, a man who believed in the laws of physics, encountered the impossible. His son's footprints led to the water's edge and ended. The stream was narrow, about 15 feet across. Due to the recent frost, it was completely frozen to the bottom. The ice was smooth, solid, and most importantly, covered with the same untouched layer of fresh snow. There was not a single footprint on it, nor were there any on the opposite bank. Samuel shone his flashlight in all directions. Elias's footprints did not veer to the left or right. They did not lead back. There were no signs that he had slipped or fallen. There were no dents, no traces of a struggle, nothing. Just a straight chain of footprints that reached the frozen creek and ended as if Elias...
This bush of yours is clearly over the property line. Well, I want you to go into your shed and get some trimmers and take care of it.
As if Elias had taken off vertically at that point. Overcome with horror, but still trying to think logically, Samuel crossed the creek back and forth several times. The ice was as hard as rock. He walked hundreds of yards up and down the stream. Nothing. Not a single crack. Not a single gully where he could have fallen through. Not a single footprint on the other bank. Returning to the last footprint, he shone his flashlight on it again and again, trying to find some kind of explanation. But there was no explanation. That night, Samuel Holloway did not sleep. He heated up all the flares they had and fired them into the black, starless sky every half hour. In the morning, as soon as the satellite phone picked up a signal, he contacted the rescue service. His voice was calm, and he spoke like a scientist, stating facts. But behind that calmness lay the chilling horror of a father whose reality had been shattered. The rescue team arrived by helicopter at noon. It was led by Frank McGregor, a veteran of search and rescue operations in Alaska. He listened to Samuel's disjointed but accurate account and immediately headed for the creek. What he saw shocked even him. In 20 years on the job, he had seen dozens of tragic and strange cases, but never anything like this. It was like a picture from a magic trick, he said later. There were tracks, there was a barrier, and then nothing. Complete emptiness. We documented and photographed every inch. We brought dogs with us. And that was the strangest thing. 2 experienced search dogs confidently picked up the trail from the camp. They followed Elias's tracks precisely. But at the creek, where the tracks ended, the dogs stopped dead in their tracks. They began to whine, spin around, and then, with their tails tucked between their legs, tried to run back. They couldn't pick up the trail any further. They couldn't smell him on the ice, on the other bank, or in the air. Their behavior indicated not just a loss of the trail, but complete confusion and even fear. It was as if the source of the scent had simply ceased to exist at that point in space. The search continued for 6 days. Rescuers, volunteers, and rangers combed the area square by square. They found nothing, not a single clue, not a single discarded item. The weather, as luck would have it, was clear and calm, which made the lack of results even more ominous. Samuel Holloway, remaining at the camp, was slowly going mad with helplessness. He, a man who knew this nature, understood that his son could not have simply gotten lost. Something else had happened. On the 7th day, a helicopter pilot flying over the higher slopes spotted a piece of dark fabric on a gray scree slope. It was about 400 yards from the stream, but much higher up the hill, up a steep, difficult slope, where there was no point in going from where Elias had disappeared. The ground team reached the spot a few hours later. It was Elias's jacket, a heavy, warm carpet. It wasn't just lying on the rocks. It was caught on a sharp ledge and covered with small stones. The jacket was dirty, stained with a dark substance, possibly mud or sludge, despite the absence of nearby swamps, and it was torn. 3 long, parallel tears gaped on the back and sleeve. Experts who examined it later concluded that the tears did not resemble the marks left by the teeth or claws of a bear or wolf. The fabric had not been cut, but torn, as if it had been stretched with incredible force in different directions. This discovery completely destroyed all rational explanations. Did she fall through the ice? The ice was intact. Was she attacked by an animal? There were no signs of a struggle, no blood. The dogs behaved strangely, and there was unusual damage to the jacket. Did she leave on her own? The tracks were straight and broke off. Why would he walk up a steep slope in the dark without a jacket in 4-degree frost? It defies the instinct for self-preservation. Kidnapping by a human, in one of the wildest and most deserted places on the planet, without a single trace of anyone else in the snow? Absurd. The phenomenon of paradoxical undressing, which sometimes occurs in severe hypothermia, didn't fit either. Elias had been gone too short a time to freeze to that extent, and it didn't explain how he had covered 400 yards of snow and rocks without leaving a single trace. The search was called off after 2 weeks. Elias Holloway was never found. The official report was short and vague, missing in the wilderness. In private conversations, rescuers said the case left them with a heavy feeling, a feeling of touching something beyond their experience and understanding. Samuel Holloway left Alaska a month later. He never returned to field work. A man of science, he was left alone with a set of data that was impossible to systematize. A straight line of footprints in the snow leading to nothingness, the unnatural silence that enveloped the camp, and a torn jacket on a cold mountainside.
Oh shit, I can't see our man.
Mountainside. These 3 facts shattered his world. The story of Elias Holloway became another quiet, unsolvable chapter in the vast book of unexplained disappearances. It serves as a reminder that in the great silence of the wilderness, there are phenomena for which humanity has yet to find laws or explanations. There are only questions, and traces that end at a frozen stream. The Noatak National Wildlife Refuge in northwestern Alaska is one of the last truly wild places on the planet. It is not a park in the usual sense, with trails and campgrounds. It is 6.5 million acres of pristine, untouched land, where the geography still seems temporary, and the presence of humans fleeting and out of place. In this land of rivers, mountains, and endless tundra, there are places where no human has ever set foot. And it was here, in the heart of this silence, that the Tom family arrived in the summer of 1981 to take the trip of their dreams. They did not know that this journey would turn into a never-ending nightmare, and that the name of their son, Arlen, would be added to the quiet but eerie list of those whom this land took without leaving a trace or an answer. Ray and Janice Tom were no strangers to adventure. Ray, a 42-year-old geologist, spent most of his life on field expeditions. Janice, his 40-year-old wife, was a high school biology teacher and an avid hiker. Their 14-year-old son, Arlen, was the product of their love for the wilderness. From early childhood, they took him with them, teaching him how to pitch a tent, build a fire, read a map, and most importantly, respect and understand a world where humans are only guests. Arlen was a quiet, observant teenager who preferred the silence of the forest to the noise of the city. A trip down the Cougarock River in the Noatak National Wildlife Refuge was to be his first severe, almost adult test. They had been preparing for this trip for nearly a year. They carefully studied maps, bought the best equipment available at the time, and planned their route. In early August 1981, a small seaplane dropped them off on the riverbank, where they began their journey. The first 2 days were exactly as they had imagined. Difficult crossings, breathtaking landscapes, and a feeling of complete unity with nature and with each other. They saw grizzly bears from a safe distance and herds of caribou passing through the tundra. Everything was going according to plan. On the evening of the 3rd day, they set up camp on a dry, grassy spit by the river. The day was clear and warm. Ray built a fire while Janice prepared dinner. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in incredible shades of orange and purple. They ran out of drinking water. Arlen, as he had done many times before, took 2 empty mess kits and a headlamp, even though it was still light enough. "I'll go to the river and get some water," he said. The river was only 30 yards from the tent, and its sound was clearly audible. "Okay, just be careful near the shore. It's slippery," Janice replied, without looking up from her cooking. "I'll be quick," Arlen said.
Oh, come on!
Disappeared behind the low willow bushes growing near the water. Those were the last words they heard from him. 15 minutes in the everyday world is nothing. In the Alaskan wilderness at sunset, it can be an eternity. For the first 5 minutes, Ray and Janice weren't worried. But when 10 minutes passed and Arlen still hadn't returned, Ray put down the wood and called out, "Arlen, are you okay?" The only response was the sound of the river and the crackling of the fire. Janice felt a chill run down her spine. "Maybe he just decided to wash the pots," she said to her husband, but there was no confidence in her voice.
This
When 15 minutes had passed,
What the
Ray
fuck?
grabbed his flashlight. "I'll go check," he said. He reached the water's edge in a minute. There was no one on the pebble beach. 2 pots stood at the water's edge, filled to the brim. Arlen was gone. Ray shone his flashlight around on the other side of the river. Nothing. He shouted his son's name, and his cry, full of alarm, was drowned out by the sound of the water. Janice ran up to him, her face white with fear. Together they began to comb the shore, looking into every shadow, every clump of bushes. They shouted his name over and over until they were hoarse. But there was no answer. The ground by the river was rocky, and there were no footprints. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of blood, nothing that could indicate an animal attack. Their son, their 14-year-old boy, had simply disappeared, walking 30 yards away from the camp to fetch water. They didn't sleep that night. They built a massive fire and fired flares into the air. At dawn, Ray, following a prearranged emergency plan, turned on their emergency radio beacon, and the agonizing wait began. Rescuers were unable to reach them until late the next day. After listening to the disjointed story of the grief-stricken parents, they began a systematic search. The first 2 days yielded absolutely nothing. It seemed as if the boy had vanished into thin air. All hope rested on the canine search team, which arrived on the 3rd day of the search. It was then that this story began. Two special German Shepherds. The rest of us were already preparing to find the boy, wounded or frightened in the bushes. But about 10 yards before reaching the thicket, both dogs stopped abruptly. Their behavior changed in an instant. They whimpered, and the hair on their necks stood on end. They began to resist, refusing to go any further. The dog handlers, experienced professionals, tried to get them to move, but the dogs fell into a state close to panic. They growled, not at anything in particular, but at the thicket itself, and backed away, trying to break free from their collars. The rescuers were puzzled. They had never seen such a reaction. The dogs were not afraid of the smell of a bear or a wolf. They were trained to work in such conditions. They were fearful of something else, something that caused their instinct for self-preservation to completely override all commands. Arlen's trail led straight to these thickets, and then, judging by the dog's reaction, it either broke off or mixed with something that caused them to panic. After combing through the thickets foot by foot, the people found nothing. No traces, no clues, no Arlen. The search operation had reached its first, most bizarre impasse. The failure of the canine calculations was a turning point in the case of Arlen Tom's disappearance. Until that moment, the rescuers had been dealing with a tragic but potentially explainable situation. Now they were faced with something that did not fit into their years of experience. The atmosphere in the search camp changed. The professionalism remained, but it was mixed with an oppressive sense of anxiety, a feeling that they had entered a territory where different rules applied. The search became more cautious, with people looking around more often, listening to the silence between gusts of the pit. On the 4th day of the search, one of the groups was methodically combing a wooded slope about half a mile from the camp. It was routine, exhausting work. Then one of the volunteers, a former soldier named Mike, stopped and looked up. Against the gray sky, he noticed a dark spot on the branch of a tall spruce tree. It was too regular in shape to be a nest or a cluster of pine needles. Using binoculars, he confirmed his hunch. It was a headlamp. The find was strange from the start. The headlamp was hanging from a thick, bare branch about 8 feet high. It hadn't just been thrown there. An elastic strap had been carefully looped over the branch, as if someone had taken it off their head and hung it up. To do that, someone as tall as Arlen would have had to either jump or climb something. But the ground beneath the tree was covered with a thick layer of untouched moss. There were no footprints, no broken branches. The tree trunk was smooth, with no scratches that boots would have left while climbing. The switch on the lantern was in the off position. This detail was alarming. A person lost in the woods at night does not turn off their only source of light, and certainly not hang it on a high branch where it would be difficult to reach. This action was devoid of survival logic. It was more like a ritual or a sign. But what did it mean? The rescuers searched every inch around the tree. There was nothing. No traces, no other items. Only this lone flashlight hanging silently above the trees. The search continued. Ray and Janice, whose faces had turned into gray masks of grief over the past few days, refused to leave the camp. They clung to a faint hope. But with each passing day, that hope faded, giving way to cold, sticky despair. On the 9th day, when the official search was about to be called off, another team made a final discovery. Far from where the lantern had been found, in thick bushes at the foot of an old tree, lay a boot. Arlen's boot. It was dry and clean, except for a few leaves stuck to it. It was not torn or damaged. The laces were completely untied. It lay as if it had been carefully removed and placed in the bushes. There was no sign of the other boot anywhere nearby. And again, as in the previous cases, there were absolutely no traces around it. This discovery was the last straw. It added another element to the picture that is characteristic of the strangest cases of disappearance. Paradoxical undressing. But this did not resemble the actions of a person in hypothermia who, in agony, tears off their clothes. It was methodical. The flashlight was turned off and hung up. The hook was removed, unlaced, placed back in its place. Every action was deliberate. Whose? 2 weeks later, the active search was called off. Arlen Tom was listed as missing. Ray and Janice left no attack, taking with them a void that would never be filled. The official report, filed later, was full of omissions and assumptions. The most likely version was an attack by a predator, despite the complete lack of evidence. It was the only way to close a case that had no rational solution. But the story did not end there. A year passed. The name Arlen Tom became another quiet tragedy in the history of Alaska. In the fall of 1980, a commercial hunter, an Inupiat Indian, was checking his traps in an area rarely visited, even by locals. He was dozens of miles from the Tom family camp. To get there, he had to cross a river and climb a high, wind-swept plateau, a rocky desert where almost nothing grew. No tourist trails led to this place. Passing between two huge boulders covered with lichen, the hunter noticed a glint on the ground. He bent down and picked up the object. It was a simple handmade bracelet woven with colored threads and decorated with a small bead. Later, Janice Tom recognized it. It was a gift she had made for her son on his 14th birthday. Bracelet he had never taken off. It lay on the ground exactly between two boulders, as if it had been placed there on purpose. The hunter, the man who had grown up in these parts and knew the language of nature, looked around. There were no bones, no scraps of clothing, no other signs of human presence. Only this small, man-made object, a vast, indifferent desert, on a plateau where a 14-year-old, even if he had survived, would never have been able to reach. This last discovery became the most chilling epilogue to the story of Arlen Tom. It confirmed once and for all that his disappearance was not the result of blind chance or a predator. It was a series of deliberate actions that were utterly alien to human logic. Water left by the river, a scent leading to bushes that dogs fear, a lantern hung 8 feet high, a single shoe, and finally a bracelet carried dozens of miles and left on top of a desert plateau. It didn't look like someone was covering their tracks. It looked like a chain of inexplicable details, a grim exhibition where the boy's personal belongings served as exhibits. It was as if some force or creature had not simply taken him away. Still methodically, step by step, he was dismantled, leaving his parents and rescuers with these unsolvable mysteries as the only thing they had left of their son. We will never know what happened to Arlen Kahn during those 15 minutes by the Kubarak River. This story makes even the most ardent skeptics believe in something else.
Ignore entity Raven and make every tap feel like a touchdown. Score yours at mtv.com/Raven. Not for creating. No one wants to be measured for cancer, but a treatment can be. Keytruda is linked to treat cancer. FDA approved for 18 types of cancer, including small stage and advanced cancers. What those cancers is a kind of liver and Keytruda can be used with the medicine and for adult in adults when your bladder or urinary tract cancer is spread or cannot be removed by surgery.
Shortness of breath, chest pain, severe stomach pain, irregular heartbeat, extreme tiredness, dizziness or fainting, changes in appetite, thirst or urine, confusion, memory problems, persistent or severe muscle weakness, muscle cramps, fever, rash, itching or flushing. There may be other side effects. Tell your doctor about all medical conditions, including immune or nerve system problems, such as Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, lupus, myasthenia gravis, or Guillain-Barré syndrome, or tissue or stem cell transplant, or receive chest radiation. Keytruda can permanently help you.
Keytruda is an immunotherapy and is also being studied in hundreds of clinical trials, exploring ways to treat even more types of cancer. It's true. Keytruda. See all the types of cancer Keytruda is soon or at Keytruda.com and ask your doctor. Keytruda could be right for
And that's it. These stories are just a small part of what Alaska hides. Here, people disappear in such a way that even experienced trackers and rescuers throw up their hands in despair. Logic breaks down, theories don't add up, and the clues found seem like a mockery of the human mind. If you like the video, like it, subscribe, and rate in the comments which of these stories you think is the scariest. There are more investigations and unexplained disappearances ahead. See you next time. Alaska is a place where nature itself seems to keep its secrets and is in no hurry to share them with humans. The stories of Simon Clark, Wayne Malone, and Maria Hopper are just 3 chapters in a long book of disappearances that cannot be explained by conventional logic. A neatly rolled sleeping bag by a cliff, a boat with scratches on the bottom, glasses on a tree, a bag with bloodstains at the roots. All these clues look as if they were left there on purpose, like critical evidence. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, and share your comments. Your participation inspires new videos. Now let's move on to inexplicable stories that leave more questions than answers. Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska is a place that inspires awe in and of itself. The largest national park in the United States, covering more than 13 million acres. It is a place where glaciers slide into narrow valleys and peaks over 16,000 feet high tower over the tundra and nameless streams. Here, humans are always guests, and more often than not, they are casual passers-by, almost invisible against the backdrop of the gigantic natural landscape. It was here in June 1992 that a 39-year-old Washington state resident named Simon Clark arrived. He was not a professional climber or geologist by training. Still, since his youth, he had been fascinated by cartography, rocks, and field expeditions. His home in Seattle was filled with boxes of rock samples, carefully labeled and ranged by year. For him, geology was not a profession but a passion, a way of understanding the world. That year, he planned a trip to the Nabesna Glacier, one of the most inaccessible places in Wrangell Cordillera National Park. His plan was relatively simple. A seaplane would take him to Lake Tana on June 15th. From there, he wanted to walk along the southern edge of the glacier, take a series of photographs, collect samples, and return to the lake by the 19th, where the pilot was to pick him up. Simon was born in 1953 in Tacoma, Washington. He was an electrical engineer by profession, but whenever he had the opportunity, he would head for the mountains. Friends described him as methodical, but sometimes overly confident in his abilities. He did not drink or smoke, always planned his routes carefully, and never went on a hike without leaving a note with his itinerary. For his trip to Alaska, he bought new equipment, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, climbing boots, and a navigation kit consisting of a USGS map and a compass. He did not have a satellite beacon, such devices were still rare in 1992, but he always used simple methods to mark his route. Bright ribbons, pieces of cloth on branches and cairns. His family and friends noted, Simon always left traces. He considered it his #1 safety rule. On June 15, 1992, a de Havilland Beaver seaplane took him to Lake Tana. Pilot George Wallace later said that Clark looked excited and focused. He checked his backpack, carefully secured his tent, and waved goodbye to the pilot. At that moment, there was no sign of trouble. Then there was silence. When the plane returned to the lake to pick him up on June 19th, Clark was nowhere to be found. There were no traces of a campfire or a tent on the shore. The pilot made several flyovers, nothing. A report was then filed with the National Park Service. The search began quickly. Rangers, pilots, and volunteers participated in the operation. The weather was cold, with rain and low clouds. For the first 2 days, the group searched the area around Lake Tana, to no avail. No tents, no stone cairns, no characteristic ribbons that Clark always used to mark his route were found. This immediately raised alarm bells. Clark never traveled without leaving markers. His friends who were involved in the search insisted that he was too disciplined to make such a mistake. But the terrain behaved differently. It was as if his presence had been erased. On the 5th day of the search, June 24th, volunteers stumbled upon a sleeping bag. It lay neatly rolled up on a stone platform near a cliff, 6 miles east of the lake. The sleeping bag was dry and clean, as if it had just been taken out of a tent and placed on the ground. There were no other belongings nearby. No tent, no backpack, no clothes. There were not even any traces of a campfire. The ground around it was wet from rain.
FanDuel's dropped his profit boost every college football Saturday.
That one has not been used for centuries. I'm sure it's broken, otherwise I would have seen
Tailgates
it.
everywhere. Get a profit boost every college football Saturday
You know,
with FanDuel.
Kratos, I wasn't always like this.
From
A
rain.
monster.
But the sleeping bag was dry,
Was
as if
once
it had
the
been
most
placed there very
prized
recently.
craftsman in all
Another
of
oddity,
Olympus.
a few yards from the
Zeus
find, there were
rewarded me
faint
with
traces
my
of a
marriage
grizzly
to the
bear,
beautiful
but they did not
Aphrodite.
lead to the sleeping
My
bag,
mother
but
Hera
away from it,
bragged
gradually
like
disappearing into the
The
grass.
day you killed
The Rangers'
Ares
report
was the
later
day
noted,
my world
it has
was
not been
born.
determined why the sleeping bag
That
was
day,
left in such an
Zeus
open
became
place,
the fiend
with no
you
signs of
know.
anyone having been
Worst
there.
of all,
The Clark family was particular that
he
if he
took
had
my
folded the
beloved
sleeping
daughter,
bag himself,
Pandora.
he would have done so at the camp or on the
reason
trail,
for
but not on the
living.
edge of a cliff. After the sleeping bag was
I
found, the
spend
search
my time
continued with renewed
trying
vigor.
to recreate her.
The National Park Service brought in
I
additional
failed
teams.
again.
2
and
helicopter
again.
crews, dog handlers,
still
and about
lives,
30
Spartan.
volunteers who were
I
experienced
can feel
hikers.
it.
The primary focus was on the area along the Nebezna Glacier.
You,
It seemed apparent that
Kratos,
this was where Clark might have headed,
you can bring
and
her
that this
back
was
to
where his
me.
markers should have
Your
been.
child
However,
is not my
to the
concern.
astonishment of all involved,
But
no
surely
markers
you
were
can
found.
understand.
Not a single ribbon,
You were
not a
once a
single
father,
rope,
too.
not even a twig bent by a human hand. It was as if Simon had moved cleanly, leaving no trace. This was entirely out of character for him. His sister Carol, who flew to Alaska, later said, "If you walk through the woods and don't see any markers, then it's not Simon. He couldn't have forgotten. It's part of his character." The search then took on an almost mystical tone. On June 29th, 2 weeks after his disappearance, a group of volunteers found a boot about 7 miles northeast of the lake. It was a solo climbing boot, in good condition, with the laces intact and minimal signs of wear. But the way it was found shocked everyone. The boot was in a narrow crevice between 2 rocks. It hadn't just fallen there, but seemed to have been stuck there with force. It was stuck vertically, toe down, so deep that it could only be pulled out with the help of a crowbar. The outside of the boot was relatively dry, while the inside was damp, but showed no signs of prolonged exposure to rain. There was no body or other items nearby. No socks, no backpack, no traces of human presence. Only this boot, stuck in such a way that it seemed as if someone had deliberately placed it there. Experts immediately noted that if the boot had simply fallen off the foot during a fall, or while walking, it would have remained on the surface. To achieve that level of depth, considerable effort would have been required. By this point, the search operation had been going on for more than 2 weeks. No tent, no backpack, no other pieces of clothing, no blood, no bones, no personal belongings. The traces on the ground ended abruptly, as if the man had ceased to exist in that place.
Yeah, boy, I like this sword.
The University of
This sword, motherfucker.
Consultation ruled out a bear attack.
I got this sword.
Always leaves traces of the struggle. Fur, scraps of clothing, blood. There's nothing here. Dog handlers came to the same conclusion. The dogs picked up Simon's scent only on a short stretch near the lake, but then lost it completely. Special attention was paid to the question of route markers. Simon's relatives and friends insisted that he never traveled without leaving marks, but this time there were none. A hypothesis arose. Perhaps he deliberately removed them, deciding to keep his route a secret. But why? And why then was his sleeping bag neatly rolled up at the edge of the cliff and his boot stuck in a crevice? Simon's sister Carol and 2 friends flew to Alaska to join the search. They noted several oddities that were not included in the official reports, but were discussed among a small group of volunteers. Several searchers indicated that there was an unnatural silence in the area where the sleeping bag was found. No birds were singing, not even the sound of the wind. It was as if the sound had disappeared.
What's the run store?
30 chairs this week.
What's the run store?
15 long tables. What's run? Add 8 cases of pipe glasses. Lights.
What's the run store? A set of knives.
What did you use this for? What's run?
Appeared, said one of the rangers. 2 volunteers claimed to have smelled a strong metallic odor, like rust or blood, although there were no animal remains or traces of a fire nearby. The search dogs refused twice to go beyond a certain point on the trail, growling and backing away. This was recorded in the search team's log, but the official reports emphasized the lack of traces for analysis. For the Clark family, the main shock was that he seemed to have disappeared completely. No documents, no knife, not even a mug, although usually some of a tourist's belongings are found. Only 2 items were found here: a sleeping bag and a boot. The official investigation ultimately came to a cautious conclusion. The cause of Simon Clark's disappearance could not be established. Animal attack and accident have been ruled out as unlikely. There were various unofficial versions. Falling into a crevasse. Some believed that Clark could have walked onto the glacier and fallen into a crevasse that was covered by snow. This would explain the absence of a body, but it does not explain why his sleeping bag was found rolled up at the edge of a cliff, and his boot was found crushed in a crevasse 7 miles away. Another theory was that he wanted to disappear and start a new life. But some things spoke against this. He left his documents, money, and his beloved mineral collection at home. There were no signs that he wanted to disappear. Sometimes the possibility of foul play was discussed. Someone could have encountered him in the mountains. But the area was completely deserted. Not a single camp was recorded within a 30-mile radius during those days. A search for volunteers from among supporters of anomalous hypotheses gathered a collection of similar stories from Alaska. People whose traces had been lost, whose belongings had been found neatly folded in illogical places. In 1993 and 1994, repeated searches were conducted during the warmer months. Volunteers searched riverbeds, rock slides, and even caves in the rock formations, but again nothing. Simon Clark's relatives only achieved official recognition of his death in 1997, 5 years after his disappearance. But neither they nor many of the searchers could accept that a man had simply vanished, leaving behind only 2 items that looked as if they had been deliberately placed there by someone. To this day, no one knows where Simon Clark ended up on that June day in 1992.
I suffer greatly. I tried to return to battle, but
Without me.
you know I had no choice. You must help me.
In July 1996, a 42-year-old fisherman from Utah named Wayne Malone disappeared in Clark Lake National Park. He rented a small cabin for a week and told the owner by radio that he was going fishing on the morning of July 14th. He did not return that evening. The search began the next day. Almost immediately, his boat was found 3 miles downstream. It was intact, the motor was in working order, but the key had been removed, as if someone had deliberately stalled the engine. Inside was a fishing rod, a bucket of fresh fish, and a neatly folded jacket. Strange, deep scratches, like fingernail marks, were found on the aluminium bottom, as if someone had desperately tried to hold on. Still, there were no other signs of a struggle or accident. When the boat was examined more closely, it became clear that the theory of falling overboard did not explain the details. If Malone really fell, why was the engine stopped manually? If he was thrown out, where were the marks on the shore or in the water? Rangers and volunteers flew over the entire area in helicopters and seaplanes. Boats combed the coastline and divers checked the most dangerous places. Still, no trace of a body was found.
And makes his move. One tap and a completion. Touchdown.
He was found. Dogs brought in to search confidently followed the trail from the cockpit to the shore, but at the spot where the boat was found, they lost the trail completely, as if the man had simply vanished. The case was becoming increasingly alarming. One of the rangers later recalled that in his years of service, he had seen dozens of accidents on the water, but this story immediately defied logic. It was as if someone had swept it away, he said. On the 4th day of the search, local residents joined the effort. It was then that volunteers made a discovery that really added to the sense of mystery surrounding the incident. In the fork of a tree, nearly 9 feet above the ground, lay Malone's sunglasses, neatly arranged. There were no human footprints or broken grass below. The glasses were intact, the lenses undamaged, and it looked as if they had been deliberately placed there. This detail baffled the searchers. Even experienced trackers could not explain how the item could have ended up in such a place. The bear attack theory was investigated immediately. In Alaska, this is always the first assumption. But no hair, blood, or characteristic paw prints were found around the boat. In addition, the fish in the bucket remained untouched, and it was unlikely that the animal would have ignored such easy. The idea that the man could have drowned was also not supported. The water in that area was not deep enough for the body not to float to the surface within a few days. Relatives insisted that Wayne had always been very organized. He had a habit of marking his route by making notches or leaving ribbons. This made his disappearance even stranger, as there was no sign that he had marked the trail. It seemed as if he had failed to do so for the first time in his life. By the end of July, the active search began to wind down. Dozens of people, from rangers to volunteers, combed the area, but all they found during that time was a boat with scratches on the bottom and a pair of glasses in a tree. Official reports dryly stated, no logical explanation. For Malone's family and friends, it became unbearable. His disappearance turned into one of those Alaskan mysteries where every detail only adds to the sense of incomprehension, and obvious explanations fall apart at the first careful glance. When local newspapers began to write about the strange disappearance of a fisherman from Utah, interest in the case skyrocketed. Wayne Malone was known as a practical man with experience in hiking and fishing. His friends insisted that he never took unnecessary risks and treated nature with respect. For his family, the idea that he could have accidentally fallen into the water or died from stupidity seemed impossible. Relatives insisted on expanding the search, and then the FBI got involved, as the disappearance occurred within a national park and was accompanied by circumstances that did not fit the usual versions. All the materials were analyzed during August. The Rangers' report on the boat contained a note. The scratches on the bottom looked like they had been made by fingernails. But in the official document, this was phrased more mildly as undetermined damage. The photos of the boat taken immediately after its discovery were never made public. Several searchers admitted
this?
in private conversations that what they saw was extremely disturbing. It looked as if a person had been in a panic and scratched the metal trying to stay inside. The glasses and fork of a tree became the second unsolvable mystery. Investigators suggested that they could have been brought there by the wind or a bird. However, the glasses were heavy, with metal frames, and no bird could have placed them neatly in the fork. Moreover, no strong winds were reported in the area during the search. The FBI reports also mention this episode, but without attempting to explain it, they simply state that the item was found and could not have ended up naturally. With each passing day, it became increasingly clear that Wayne's body would not be found. Usually, drowned bodies float to the surface within 3-5 days. Even assuming that he had been carried away by the current, the area searched covered dozens of miles down the river, and the chances of finding his remains were extremely high. But the search yielded absolutely nothing. There was no piece of clothing, no footprints, no bones, not even any objects that could have washed ashore. Everything disappeared with him. This disappearance was reported as a case with no logical explanation. Journalists writing about it called it a case with no version. Against the backdrop of routine accidents and tourist deaths, the case seemed eerily empty. It was as if Malone's disappearance itself was pushing people to think that there was something more to it than a simple tragedy. All that remained for the family was speculation. His wife said that Wayne was a man of habit. He always packed his things neatly, and that was precisely what was found in the boat. A folded jacket, a fishing rod, and neatly caught fish. It looked as if he intended to return in a few minutes.
Wow, I killed both of them. Stupid.
In its annual report, the FBI listed Malone's case separately, with the note, "No signs of violence, no explanation." This is a rare wording, as usually at least the most likely cause is indicated: drowning, accident, animals. In this case, even that was not done. Over time,
Good morning. Is this on? Can you hear me? Good.
Over time, Wayne Malone's story became a local legend. Fishermen and residents of Lake Clark said that since then, they had become more cautious about going out alone. Several times, people claimed to have seen a boat slowly drifting without an owner, but when they approached, it was empty. This coincidence always reminded them of that July day in 1996. That's how it remained. A boat with scratches, neatly left belongings, glasses on a tree, and no body. For the record, it was an unexplained disappearance. For the family, it was an eternal question with no answer. For investigators of such cases, it was another story that fit into a long series of mysterious disappearances in Alaska, where nature seems to be able to hide people without a trace.
Fuck.
The Tongass National Forest, the largest in the United States, covers more than 16 million acres. This place is a combination of misty fjords, cold streams, ancient fir trees, and mountains sloping down to the water. Tourists who come here often say that they feel cut off from the world. Phone service is rare, civilization seems far away, and nature itself seems to repel any human attempts to interfere with its rhythm. In July 1998, a 29-year-old traveler from Virginia named Maria Hopper arrived here. She was no stranger to camping. She had hiked the Appalachian Trail, spent nights in the Rocky Mountains, and traveled to western national parks. Her friends noted that Maria always took preparation seriously. She checked her equipment twice, kept her things in order, and always left a detailed itinerary when traveling alone. She arrived in Tongass as part of a more extended trip through Alaska. According to her family, the purpose of the trip was to listen to the silence and live in solitude for a few days. She rented a spot at a small campground near Sitka Creek, popular with fishermen and those who prefer short stays in the woods. There are only a few campsites, each surrounded by trees and overlooking the fast-flowing stream. According to their campsite neighbors, a couple from Seattle, Maria seemed calm and content on the evening of July 17th. They remembered her slender figure, her hair pulled back in a bun, and the harmonica she played by the campfire. It was around 9 p.m. The couple later recalled, "It sounded unexpectedly cozy. She was playing a simple melody and the whole forest seemed to freeze." They went to bed around 10:30 p.m., and when they woke up in the morning, they noticed the silence. There was no smoke from the campfire. Maria's tent looked open, and the girl herself was nowhere to be seen. At 8 a.m., they approached the tent. Inside, they found a backpack, neatly zipped up.